All right. Well, hello and welcome. So, we are going to be talking about our next episode here, which is on learning how to learn. And this is kind of I know it's a little bit different than what I mentioned in the introduction. We're going to get there, but we kind of have to lay some groundwork before we get there. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about train the trainer and how the training is, or how learning is super important to the leader, and how the leader needs to be a constant learner and teacher. So, all right. So there's a great Jocko podcast episode where he talks about the leader is a trainer, coach, and mentor. And we're just going to kind of just briefly breeze through that, but I think that's a great way to start the conversation. So the leader is a trainer, the coach, and a mentor. And as I mentioned in the introduction and what we're going to talk about next episode, is that every single person is a leader if you really get down and define what leadership is. So we talked about that already. I'm not going to rehash that now, but we will revisit that in the next episode. Okay, so every leader is a trainer, a coach, and a mentor. It's not a addition to your job professionally or personally, but it's just an essential part of being a leader. And so first, let's take a trainer. So to be a trainer, that means that you're a teacher. That means you're showing other people how to do things, actions, processes, right? It's more instructional. It's like, here's how you do this. Now you try it, like copy. So a trainer is teaching like how to, it's teaching the steps, it's teaching the process, whatever actions need to happen, teaching someone to tie their shoe as a child, or teaching an employee how to follow a work process or SOP, right? This is the trainer aspect of it. Then there's the coaching aspect. So as a coach, what you're doing is you're providing constructive feedback. You're showing like, hey, here's what happened today, and here's what you did well, and here's what I'd like to see an improvement on, or what you can work on to get better. So this is more, think of this as the short-term critiques on performance or on actions. This is kind of that tactical thinking, that short-term thinking, the feedback for how you did today or how you can get better tomorrow. So that's kind of how I bucket the coaching aspect. And then there's the mentorship aspect. So trainer, coach, mentor. So mentor this is like setting someone up for long-term success. This is like strategic thinking. This is like professional growth, setting someone up for success, telling them how the things that they're doing today is going to set them up for success or for failure in the future. So it's kind of that long-term approach, that long-term thinking. So there's kind of these three buckets, right? There's the trainer, this is the how-to. There's the coach, that's like the constructive feedback on what has happened today and what you could do better tomorrow, or the short-term critique or constructive feedback. And then there's the mentorship, which is more like professional growth, long-term success, strategic thinking, and sort of thing. So depending on the scenario and what's needed depends on which hat you put on at that particular moment. And different people on your team or in your world are going to be at different points in their journey, right? They might be just starting out. They might be a kid. They might be older than you and on a different journey. It just, you have to assess where each person is so you can kind of meet them where they are and assess what hat you need to put on and what scenario and what tools you need to pull out of your toolbox. And so a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about over the course of these episodes are tools or techniques that you can kind of put in your toolbox and pull them out where appropriate and use them as appropriate. So again, the focus of this conversation is going to be kind of that learning how learning works and learning how to learn, with the guise of learning how to learn for ourselves so that we can grow and improve, but then also that the people around us, we can put on the appropriate hat of being the trainer, the coach, or the mentor. Okay. So that's kind of the intro of what we're going to talk about. So one of the areas when you're talking about training or learning is the difference between active learning and passive learning. So active learning is where you're actively engaged in what you're doing, and that could be through utilizing your different senses, like you're hearing about it, you're seeing it, you're doing it with your motor skills, et cetera, right? And then passive learning is more like you're just getting the information talked at you or just thrown at you, but you're not really actively a part of the learning process. And so probably, as you can deduce from those two terminologies, it's better to be actively engaged in the learning if you want the learning to stick. So an important note to make here, and something that we're going to kind of pull on this thread as we continue to talk, is that you really can't make another person interested in learning something that they're not interested in learning. So this actually comes up, and I've had this question before professionally, where people are like, well, how do I make one of my people care about what I'm trying to get them to do? And really, you cannot make someone else care. But there are some tools that we're going to talk about that will help you kind of connect with them at various levels and understand where they are in their journey, and so that you can kind of coach them in a way that kind of nudges them in the right direction. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember as a trainer that at the end of the day, you really don't control what someone else does and what they're interested in. And so all you can do is try to connect with them and to do things like explain the why and the background behind what you're trying to get them to know and understand. And there's other tools that we'll talk about, but that's just kind of a little bit of getting ahead of myself. But you want to be actively engaged. So a little bit about how the brain works. So interesting thing about the brain is that only in the last few years, like really the last 5 years or maybe 10 years, and that might even be a stretch, have we started to have the tools in science to be able to understand how the brain works. So a lot of myths have been dispelled recently through cognitive research, cognitive science, that were kind of a misconception that happened over the years that people might still believe because it just takes a while for the information to get out there, right? One of the common myths is that different people have different learning styles. And before you just shut the podcast off because you don't agree with that, just listen to what I'm saying real quick, okay? So there's a great book called Make It Stick. And it's a really an academic book, but there's some really interesting nuggets in there that have kind of informed a lot of this learning how to learn stuff that I'm going to talk about. There's another great book on the subject called Small Learning, and that's also a great primer to this information as well. But it's the learning styles thing. So what we have found recently, and I say we like I was part of the scientific study, but what science has learned recently is that it's not the person that has a different learning style per se, although we'll come back to that. It's really about the thing that you're learning, the subject matter of what you're learning that determines your learning style. So the example that I use is if you're teaching someone how to change the oil in their car, you could have a PowerPoint and that might be helpful. You could have a video showing someone changing the oil in the car. You could explain the why behind it and the principles that go into the different aspects of selection of oil and viscosity and like all these different topics. But at the end of the day, if you want someone to be proficient at changing the oil in their car, there probably is a portion of classroom training that would be required ideally speaking, especially if they're going through some sort of like mechanic style training. But at the end of the day, if you want someone to be good at changing oil in their car, they have to actually get out there and change the oil in a car, and probably do it a few times to get confident in how to do it. So where I'm going with this is that it's not necessarily what the person prefers, but it's what you're trying to teach someone. So in that example, there is a level of understanding of training that's involved, but then there's more so a level of actions and motor skills and actually doing the thing that the person has to go through in order for them to actually learn that skill. And so now if you change the subject and you say, okay, well, now we're teaching somebody a philosophical abstract concept, well, that's more of a mental exercise, and it lends itself more towards a lecture, a presentation, or a group discussion, right? To be actively involved. You might have a group discussion where peers are interacting with each other and that sort of thing, which is a great learning technique, talking about what you're learning. But there's no actual motor skill in that case, right? So in that case, you could take a different approach. Or if you're teaching, a mathematical skill, there may be like some show your work kind of stuff where you're working on a proof or working on your algebraic equation and you have to actually write it out. There's a certain level of skill there for that portion of it as well. So you can see that depending on what you're trying to teach someone, or for you, what you're trying to learn, kind of depends on the learning style. So people are naturally more geared towards, maybe someone is more mechanically inclined, or maybe someone is more mathematically inclined, or someone else is more, artistic, or whatever it is. So when you have kind of that natural leaning towards something, that's the kind of stuff that you like to do and that you like to learn about. And so you can see how it would be a misconception that someone would say, well, like, I like to work on engines, therefore I learn better by doing than I do by seeing or by hearing. But in reality, it's because the thing that they like to do requires that type of learning or that type of skill for them to kind of learn in that best way. So not that it matters that we bust that myth, but the important thing to take away for your toolbox is that knowing what type of thing you're trying to learn or you're trying to teach will determine the type of practice or the type of instruction or the type of tool that you're going to use to teach that person. And so this is a good segue into a little bit about how the brain works. So the human brain is filled with all these neurons, and these neurons are cells that are kind of interconnected with each other. There's like 100 billion of them in the human brain. And whenever you think, these neurons are communicating with each other. And the way that they communicate is they release chemicals into these little teeny tiny gaps between them. And so anytime you think, remember, speak, do, you're firing, they call it firing, or these electrical signals. And a good way to think about it is like an electrical grid, like you're plugging in these different nodes of connection points, one to another. And so anytime you communicate, when neurons communicate, I should say, when one neuron connects with another neuron, they connect and they form a relationship. And this is, obviously a gross oversimplification, but it's what's happening in the brain. So anytime you have a new experience, or you learn something new, or you do something new, whether that's something that you're listening to, watching, learning, talking about, anytime you do something new, you're forming these connections in the brain. And so this is really important. So anytime you form a new connection in the brain, connecting one piece of information to another piece of information that you just learned, this connection is very weak and temporary. And so everyone has had that experience before where you maybe learned something a long time ago from school or from high school or from elementary school, but it's something that you learned a really long time ago. And you know that you learned it, but you don't remember it, right? Because you never actually tried, you never actually used that information beyond the initial learning of that information. And that's because it was a weak and temporary connection. So the important thing to remember here is that if you want to ingrain something, or you want to remember it or be able to do it, the more times you use that connection, that neural connection in your brain, the more times you use it, the stronger that connection becomes. And so this has a lot of interesting implications. So one way that you can make that connection stronger is by using all of your senses, or as many of your senses as you can. And one great example of that would be actually writing something down physically with a pen and paper or pencil and paper that you're trying to learn. So there's different techniques, like if you're looking at something in a book and you highlight it, that may not be all that effective, although it's a great way to kind of mark something to come back to later. But you're not writing it. And so actually writing it into a notebook or a piece of scratch paper, especially if you write it multiple times, you're using a different area of your brain than you are, say, when you're just reading it or listening to it or even typing it into a computer. When you're physically writing it, it uses a different portion of your brain, and it makes that connection stronger. So one of the ways to learn something, if you're trying to learn something, is to write it down. And we'll come back to that later. But the more times you can listen to something, look at it visually, write it down, talk about it with other people, any of the senses that you can use and touch, or the more times that you think about it, remember it, write it down, listen to it, etc., those are going to all strengthen the connection. So a funny example that I like to use for the first time you learn something, the connection is weak and temporary, and you have to physically do work to make it feel normal or strengthen that connection to the point where you'll remember it, is to try to brush your teeth with your opposite hand than you normally do. And if you try that, it's going to feel really weird and awkward, even though it's something that you've done many, many, many times, but you're doing it with the opposite hand, and the brain is just like, what is going on here? This is not how we do this, right? Same thing with writing with the opposite hand, or any number of things, doing it one way versus the way that you normally do it. You'll see like your brain is kind of like, whoa, hold on. I'm not good at this. Like, what are we doing? So key takeaways here is that anytime you want to learn something, you need to strengthen to the best of your ability the neural pathway. And the way you do that is through repetition. So another interesting thing about the way the brain works, in that the more we do something, the easier it gets. You can probably already see the connection to habits, and the way that if you have a certain way of thinking that you've always had historically, that is your kind of default mode, and that's kind of the way the brain is kind of wired, so to speak, and almost in a literal way, wired in a certain direction. And so habits are kind of these like automatic things that we do, that the brain has just kind of got this pattern that it does, and it just imprinted in your brain. And so if you want to change your habit, that's a topic for another episode, but changing a habit requires sort of rewiring the default mode for that particular thing for your brain. And there's ways to do that. And we'll touch on that a little bit here, actually. So there's this fantastic book by Sean Anker. It's called The Happiness Advantage. And there's actually a really great TED Talk that is a kind of a 20-minute TED Talk summary of the book that does a great job of kind of summarizing it, if you want to take a look at that online for free. But he talks about raising positivity in the present and the brain experiencing what is known as the happiness advantage, the title of the book. And so what they found through these studies, and I found this fascinating, that the brain in a positive state of mind performs better than it does at negative, neutral, or stressed. In fact, the brain is 31% more productive, more intelligent, has more energy, more creative. It's basically 31% smarter when it's in a positive state of mind than it is at negative, neutral, or stressed. And when I first learned about this, I was kind of like, okay, so I get that positive would be better than negative and stressed, but the one that surprised me was the neutral. Like, I would think neutral would be just as productive as positive, but not the case. Negative, neutral, or stressed, you're basically, said the opposite way. You're 31% dumber in those modes than you are when you're in a positive state of mind. We're going to kind of define what a positive state of mind is. When we talk about the positive state of mind, we're not talking about just like smiling, happy, bubbly, like, on cloud nine kind of happiness, but we're talking more about sort of an outlook, or a positive outlook, positive mental attitude, or sort of like that can-do attitude, or just that attitude of like, get it, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I know I can. That's what we're talking about when we say a positive state of mind. Now, if you're naturally a very happy, bubbly person, that's fine. Not anything wrong with that, but it's not to say, if that's not your natural disposition, that it has to be. Although, like we were talking about, as you sort of ingrain certain patterns on your brain, find people that have a particularly negative state of mind, it's because of the way that they're thinking and speaking and acting. That's this feedback loop that continues to keep them in that pattern. So it's kind of an interesting thing with the neural pathways, that the more you use them in a negative way or a positive way, the more that they tend to kind of head in that direction, and sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. So when the brain releases chemicals from one neuron to another in order to, do something or remember something or think about something, it's releasing chemicals. One of those chemicals that most people have heard of is dopamine. But one kind of fun fact about dopamine is that it has two functions. So it is known as like the happiness molecule, or sort of like something that kind of gets us to do things that we think will make us happy, or something like that. Like there's a lot of things that dopamine is involved in, but the two that we're focused on, or the one in particular actually, is that yes, it is the happiness molecule, but it also is the learning molecule. It turns on learning receptors in the brain, which is really interesting. One point about the 31% smarter is that, it's funny because if you have kids or have been around kids, that they've kind of figured this out, right? I mean, they're not going to ask their parents for something when their parents are in a negative, neutral, or stressed mode, right? They kind of wait for everybody to be, in a positive state of mind to ask for that favor, or, ask for something that they want or whatever like that. So it's kind of interesting that we kind of intuitively know this, but when we kind of explicitly say it and how it applies, it kind of takes on a different meaning. So in the Happiness Advantage book, he talks about kind of 5 things that you can do to sort of rewire the brain in a positive direction. And kind of, as the idea is that the more you kind of wire it into a new direction and you start to see things in those ways, that it sort of kind of will have this positive impact on the way that you see the world and then the way that you act. But more importantly, you get that 31% boost, right? And so I don't know about you, but I kind of need all the help I can get. So, all right. So the first thing is actually a gratitude practice, which, there's tons of information on the interwebs about gratitude, but the real simple, easy, practical thing that you can do, and the number one thing you can do to quote unquote rewire the brain is this thing called the 3 gratitudes. And I actually do this. So I do training professionally, and I'll actually do these gratitude sessions, and sometimes it's with a small group, sometimes it's with a big group. And it is continually amazing to me how people will open up, as long as, everyone is doing it. and, and we do, and how much you can learn about people, how much you can bond with people over just talking about 3 things that you're thankful for or grateful for. And so the way to do this is literally to just grab a piece of paper. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be a notebook, or just could be a scratch piece of paper. And you literally just write down 3 things that you're thankful for or grateful for in the study that they cite in the book is for 21 to 28 days, 3 new things each day. So it can't be the same 3 things every day. It's got to be 3 new things. And what it does is it teaches your brain to look for positive patterns versus, negative, stressful, or otherwise patterns, right? Another practice that they talk about is journaling 1 positive experience in the past 24 hours. So so each one of these 5 things, there's a study that's cited that shows positive attitude resulting in this 31% increase. Now, you don't have to do all 5. You could literally just do the 3 gratitudes thing for 21 to 28 days or longer, and it'll have the intended effect. But remember, we're talking about learning and learning how to learn and learning how to coach and train other people. This is a great practice, this 3 gratitude practice. If you yourself are trying to learn something, to do this before you go into your deep learning session. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to do that session. But just doing this with your small group or even one-on-one with somebody at the beginning of the day, the 3 gratitude practice, is such an incredible team building exercise. I just can't emphasize that enough. It's been super powerful for me. Okay, so number 2 was the journaling, 1 positive experience in the past 24 hours. And what that does is, so that would be like at the end of the day, or at the end of the day about the current day, or you could do it in the morning for the previous day, however you choose, whatever works best for you. But the way it works is it allows your brain to actually relive that positive experience. And if you look hard enough, you can always find something positive in the past 24 hours. So that's the second one. The third one is actually exercise. And the exercise, according to that study, basically it teaches your brain that your behavior matters, and your not only your words and thoughts, but your behaviors influence your outlook. And there's a lot of information about exercise and the benefits to the brain that we'll talk about in future episodes, but that's another thing. The number 4 is meditation. There's been a ton of studies, but the one in the book specifically is about how to, meditation doesn't necessarily need to take on any type of spiritual type meaning, although it can, but what it does for the brain is to allow it to focus on the present or focus on the task at hand. And we're kind of in this world of, this cultural ADD, kind of like, thousands of things bombarding us all the time, right? So meditation kind of allows you to kind of train your brain to be focused on one thing or one task at a time, which is an excellent time management technique that we'll talk about that subject later as well in a future episode. And then number 5 is random acts of kindness. And they talk about once a day, sending 1 email praising or thanking someone for something that they did. Now, the important thing about all of these, the gratitude, the journaling, especially the random acts of kindness thing, even if it's just like a positive email to someone, it's got to be genuine. That's the number 1 thing. It's got to be genuine. And trust me, like when you're writing the 3 gratitudes, they don't have to be these big grandiose things, although they can be. And of course we are grateful for, things like family and friends, that should be the first couple, few days of things that we're saying. But in my experience doing this with hundreds of people, even someone, a common one that people will say after the first couple of days of doing it is like that they're thankful for waking up in the morning, or that, we're sitting there, in a classroom setting or in an office setting or in a production setting, and they're saying like, today I'm thankful for my cup of coffee that I have that's like keeping me going. It doesn't have to be anything like grand to have the intended effect, which I think is really cool. But, again, random acts of kindness, gratitudes, those sort of things, they need to be genuine. Otherwise, they don't have the intended effect. And if that's a struggle, then find something that you're thankful for. And, like they say, like, act as if, right? Try it, fake it till you make it, sort of thing. Like, be grateful. And over time, you will actually indeed genuinely be grateful, and that's going to show. Random acts of kindness thing, don't do it unless it's going to be grateful, unless it's going to be genuine. That's super important, because otherwise people can see right through that. Okay, here's a cool one. So IQ or attitude. So everyone's probably heard of the IQ test, right? It's just basically a measurement of how book smart you are, essentially. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's really kind of what it boils down to. And it is something that is quite often used as predictors of like lifetime success, or, whatever that means, right? And they're finding now, though, something interesting with these studies, that only 25% of job success is predicted by IQ. Now, 25% is a lot. That's actually a bigger predictor than a lot of pretty much any other metric that, like family history or background or experience, or, there's hundreds of things that you could use as a predictor of job success, or you could argue life success. But so 25% is a big number. However, 75% is predicted by optimism, social support, and ability to see stress as a challenge rather than a threat. What are those things? Those are your attitude. That's your outlook. So what it said in summary, 25% of job success is predicted by IQ. 75% is predicted by attitude, especially, right, positive attitude, right? So having a positive attitude is the most powerful thing that you can have and that you can instill on your team. Having a negative attitude will definitely trickle down to a team of people, or trickle across to other departments or peers or coworkers, right? Having a positive attitude doesn't guarantee other people will have a positive attitude. Having a negative attitude is a pretty strong push towards everyone else having a negative attitude around you. It doesn't guarantee success, but it's a 75% predictor compared to IQ, meaning that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but if you have that can-do attitude, you're gonna succeed, right? You're gonna continue to figure it out. You're gonna succeed. So I just find that so fascinating, so important to know, both as a mentor, as a coach, that sort of thing. I mean, it's really powerful information. So another really important thing to know for a leader, for a coach, for a trainer, is what brain state is the other person in, or the other people in. And what I mean by that is, are they in, or could they be in, a fight or flight mode? And so you probably have heard of fight or flight. There's others, there's like freeze, and there's other things in there too, but we're going to just call all of that fight or flight. And this is a defense mechanism that the brain goes into when it's in duress or it's under stress. And so the amygdala is a portion of the brain, is kind of the primitive brain, or the base brain, or is responsible for the base emotions. Whereas like the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe is kind of the logic part of the brain. And so, we have this balance of these like gut reactions or, emotional reactions of the amygdala That's kind of the fight or flight stuff. And then we have the logic center, which can, kind of allow us to reason and think about the future and so on. Well, when we're in a state of stress, the brain can go into fight or flight. Now, it can in fact be like a physical fight, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. It could be as something as simple as a text message or an offhanded comment from somebody or some other form of, what somebody might see as a mild stressor to one person could be a fight or flight trigger, although I don't like the word trigger, but in this case, it's appropriate, a trigger of fight or flight. And literally, the thing to know is that when that happens, the amygdala is in charge of the brain and the logic center actually turns off. So when the logic center is off, there's no amount of reasoning or arguing or, showing someone, like when they're in that fight or flight state, the amygdala is in charge, it's took over, and they're either going to fight or flight or freeze or whatever else they're going to do, but what they're not doing is thinking logically. And so all of us have been in that mode, and all of us have seen other people in that mode. And so the important thing, again, we're thinking of this as a leader, as a coach, as a mentor, as a trainer, is first off, not to intentionally put someone into fight or flight. That's the first thing. But then secondly is to know about this so that when we see someone in that state of mind, we know not to try to argue with them or reason with them we got to try to get them a timeout, get them away from the situation, let them calm down, let them come back, let their logic center turn on before we continue the discussion. And that in and of itself could be a whole episode, but this ties into what we were just talking about, the 25-75, where 75% prediction of success through attitude. If we see stress or problems as a problem or as a stressor, the logic part of our brain will turn off and we're not able to execute with that. Not only are we not getting the 31% smarter boost from the happiness advantage, we're going negative, right? We're going logic center off. But if we see stress as a challenge, logic center is on, we get a different chemical release in the brain, and we kind of can go into problem solving mode, into logic mode, into different ways to kind of look at problems and predict and think about things. And so this is why it's so important to see in yourself when you're in that mode, not to be making any, arguments or major decisions or anything when you're in that mode, but also to recognize and see in someone else when they're in that mode, so that to kind of maybe protect them, or maybe just as simple as not argue with them at that point. And most importantly, you can't train someone or teach someone when they're in that mode, right? Because they're just not in the proper brain state for learning. For learning. All right. So why does all of this matter? At the end of the day, what's so important about learning how to learn? Like, yeah, I get it as a leader, maybe you got to train, the new hire or, something like that. But what is so important about learning? Well, there's a great book by Jonathan Levi. The title is The Only Skill That Matters. And he argues, the thesis of that book is that the only skill that matters is learning how to learn. Because he says that there's a quote from him, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but it'll be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So the interesting thing there is the skill of learning how to learn is so important because things change so fast, especially nowadays. Things are changing at such a crazy rate. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. That learning about the process of learning so that you can then apply that one skill on any skill that you try to learn, unlearn, relearn in the future is really, as he says, the only skill that matters, right? If you had to have one skill, being good at learning things, being good at learning, unlearning, and relearning, that's the skill that matters, right? So having that can-do attitude towards learning right, is critical. And one thing that bothers me is that, you know, our educational system is not built around, first and foremost, teaching people how to learn. We kind of just throw people a bunch of information, and I know it's much more complicated than that, and I'm oversimplifying, but I think you get what I'm saying is it's not about throwing information at people and then having them sink or swim. It's about training people on the process of learning that is going to equip them with the skills that they need to succeed, especially nowadays. Another great quote that I like is from Jim Rohn, and he says, "Don't let your learning lead to knowledge, let your learning lead to action." And it's one of those, simple to say, hard to do, but really important basics, from our back to basics discussion about learning how to learn and letting your learning not lead to knowledge, but lead to action. There's kind of I don't know who said this, but comes to mind where someone was saying like, if just the information or the knowledge was all that we needed, like everybody would be rich and have a six pack, right? You have to actually take the knowledge and then do it. And that goes back to that quote we talked about in the first episode about the Olympic coach saying that the difference between an Olympic athlete and everyone else is mastering the basics and then doing the basics every single day. So really important tie in there to learning how to learn. Great quote from Zig Ziglar is, "If you're not willing to learn, no one can help you. But if you are determined to learn, no one can stop you." I just love that. Okay, so now that hopefully I've sold you on the idea that learning how to learn is important, I've got some tips and tricks and tools and techniques for you in order to kind of help you on this journey of kind of learning how to learn. So we talked about like the only skill that matters, right? And what that is referring to is a really interesting concept from the book, The Future is Faster Than You Think. And that's kind of a really interesting read as well, though this is kind of one of the key points from the book is what they call the law of accelerating returns. So the law of accelerating returns says that contrary to common sense, the intuitive linear view, we won't experience 100 years of progress in the next 100 years. We're going to experience the equivalent of 20,000 years of progress at today's rate in the next 100 years. And this is because of the concept of exponential growth. So here's the easier to kind of digest version of that is that in the next 10 years from now, we will equal 100 years of progress at today's rate. And then in the next 100 years, we'll equal 20,000 years. Again, because it's not linear, it's exponential, right? It's that hockey puck curve that just goes crazy. So think about that. In 10 years from now, we're going to get 100 years of progress in 10 years at today's rate. So it'd actually be more than that because of the curve. But so think about a car from 1920, say, a Model T around that, just, everyone's kind of seen a Model T. And 100 years from that, from 1920 to 2020, say a Tesla Model S, right? So in 10 years, we're going to go from a Model T to a Tesla Model S, right? Model T was 40 miles per hour top speed, and it was felt like it was going to fall apart at that speed. And then 2022 Tesla Model S Plaid can go 0 to 60 in 1.98 seconds. Crazy, right? Crazy. So the law of accelerating returns basically says that technology improves in an exponential growth pattern, and as things in one area of study improve, it helps other areas, and that's why you get that exponential curve. And this is similar but different to, a lot of people have heard of Moore's law, and Moore's law had to do with computer chips. Basically, doubling their performance and shrinking in size every 2 years. It's similar to that, but it's even more exponential than that. And so it's really quite interesting. Law of accelerating returns. Next 10 years will be 100 years of progress. So when we say that, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is change. And going back to our concept of learning how to learn so that we can learn, unlearn, and relearn. So what do we mean by like learning? Like, what is that? So basically, the Webster's dictionary says like to gain knowledge or understanding of or skill in through study, instruction, or experience. And so I like the way they kind of phrase that, through study, through instruction, and experience, right? You kind of got multiple parts there. And so as a trainer, it's very common to hear someone say, like, at the end of this training, you should be able to, or you should understand that. And so that's kind of a great way to tell people what you're going to tell them. But the idea of learning is to modify or change behavior. That's really one of the biggest, that should be the biggest takeaway of any learning. If you learn something and you don't modify or change behavior, it was a waste of your time to learn that thing. So another great quote from Albert Einstein: once you stop learning, you start dying. And actually, there's been some recent cognitive science studies about mild cognitive impairment, or kind of the beginning stages of what would lead to typically to like Alzheimer's or something like that. Is one of the key things is that if you continue to learn, you continue to use those neural pathways, it actually will delay that onset of mild cognitive impairment. So it's really, really interesting. Another important note that I found through, there's this LinkedIn research. They said that employees who don't believe that they can achieve their career goals with their current employer are 12 times more likely to consider leaving. And this ties right in with the Gallup upskilling study, where they showed that basically half of employees would be extremely likely to switch to a different job if they felt that they could upskill. And so I kind of just throw that in there to say that, like, there's a lot of talk in every industry right now about people not wanting to work, young people not. Well, what it is, one of the things that it is that everyone wants to see a growth path and they want to upskill. And if they see a job as like a quote unquote dead end job, or they just don't understand how to go to the next level, that's a very high indicator that they will jump ship. And so one of the things that's really critical is to be the mentor that actually shows them the path for them to get from here to here to here to here, and kind of align it with what they're interested in, what their goals are, what their values are. And we've got more of that in another episode. Okay, another interesting thing about this law of accelerating returns and the learning how to learn and how things keep changing is that the old model of education and having a 4, 6, and 8-year degree process may be coming to an end. In fact, I think it is. I mean, there's a lot of talk about this, and the reason is because things are changing so fast, right? So by the time you have a curriculum developed, right, you're talking about things that are several years old at that point. By the time you develop a full 4-year college degree curriculum, and then the person then has to sign up for it, pay for it, and then go through the 4-year degree. And maybe they do it a little faster, a little slower, but let's say it's 4 years. So now you're like 6 or 8 years kind of behind whatever the latest and greatest is in that field at a minimum, right? It may be way more than that in some cases. So really, there's a lot of companies that are not looking for 4-year degrees anymore because they see it as old information that you have. And what they're looking to see is that people have more certificate or on-the-job training type courses that they're continually learning, like continuing education, so that they can see that pattern of learn, unlearn, relearn. And that's actually becoming quite a bit more popular. All right, so we talked about a little bit about how the brain works and about neural pathways and about how you need to be purposeful about your learning. You need to practice your learning with all your senses. You need to be actively engaged in the learning itself, and you need to actually want to learn the subject, right? There's a lot of things that go into it. So the next thing is you need to have a plan to learn, right? So if there's something that you need to know, first of all, you need to know that you need to know it, right? So there's kind of the old saying, I forget who said it now, somebody will remind me, but where there's like the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns, right? And the scary thing is the unknown unknowns, right? Because there's things like I know I don't know how to do brain surgery. Like I know that that's a thing, it's a skill set, and I know that I don't have it, right? But the things that scare me are the things that I don't know, right? So first, in order to learn something, you have to have a plan to learn it. So great quote is that a goal without a plan is just a wish. Or like Ben Franklin said, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. So we have other episodes in the plan for the future that'll be about like planning and that sort of thing. The important thing about planning is to have a flexible plan. You need to plan and you need planning, but you don't want to be too wrapped up around super specific details of the plan, because no plan survives first contact, right? Mike Tyson said everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So you need to have the plan. It points you in the right direction, but you need to make it so that it's flexible and adaptable so that you can kind of go with the flow, for just kind of some generic planning advice at that point. So, okay, so you need to have a plan for learning. So it can be as simple as finding an existing curriculum or syllabus that's already got everything mapped out for you, or you can do a very simple exercise with like the who, what, when, where, why, right? So if you have like the who, what, when, where, why, actually start with the why. Start with the why. Great book by Simon Sinek, Start with Why. That's a different context, but it still applies, right? So start with why. So what is the motivation for learning, and why is this important? So there's kind of this saying in like adult education that like if you're going to train an adult, you need to start with the why, because they need to know why what you're about to tell them is important. I would argue that applies to everyone, not just to adults. Like kids, what's the most famous question a kid will ever ask is why, right? And so the why part is important. If you can't answer the why learning something would be important, or what the motivation would be behind learning that, if you can't answer that, you probably don't need to know it. And if someone is trying to train you and they can't tell you why what they're about to tell you is important, you probably shouldn't listen, because it's probably not the right instructor for you to have. Everybody that has something to say should be able to articulate why what they're saying should matter to the listener. Okay, next would be the what, like what is the critical information that I'm going to need to learn and retain in order to understand this information? How, like what method am I going to use? Again, is what type of learning is it, and what method applies to that type of learning? And then who, like who is the target audience? If I'm training, I should be thinking about who is the ideal audience, or what should they know before, during, after, so that I can kind of plan my scope of learning around that, or a scope of training around that. And as a learner, I should be looking at like, okay, I'm the target audience, and like who's going to be in that sphere, to like who are some trusted sources, and where can I get some information, right? So there's a lot of benefits to just simply writing out a who, what, when, where, why. All right, so another key aspect of the why is kind of getting that alignment, and alignment is important because you have to align the why as a trainer, as a coach, as a mentor, as an instructor. as you have to align your why about why you feel that someone should learn what you have to say with the why of the trainee or the attendee of your event, or whatever people are coming to or you're giving to them. Like, the two whys have to be aligned. And oftentimes the miss is that the whys are not aligned. So I'm telling you that this is important because of this, and it doesn't resonate with you, therefore you don't learn it because it's not something that you consider to be valuable or important or whatever, right? So what you're trying to do as the coach or the mentor or the trainer, as the leader, is you're trying to understand what that individual person's why is. So, for example, you need to find a common connection point or alignment on priorities. A great way to do this is, we talked about the grateful exercise already. Another exercise that can be done, that I've done a lot with groups of people, is like the truth or lies game, where you come up with a couple of things that are true about yourself and one thing that isn't, and then the other person has to guess which one the lie is, and then you switch, and then they do the same thing. It's a great icebreaker, but it allows you to break the ice and kind of learn about each other. Then later you run through the grateful exercise or a team building event or something like that, and you kind of start to get to know people, right? The goal of that is to identify what's important to them and for them to see what's important to you. And one of the things that you will typically find is that people, almost everybody will say that what's important to them is their friends and family, right? Things that are important to them are their job and their performance or their faith, or you can find alignment on safety, or there's a lot of things that you can find alignment on. And one of the reasons for doing the grateful exercises, the truth and lies, icebreakers, stuff like that, team building, having lunch with people, is to get that alignment and for them to see that everyone else on their team or everyone that they work with also thinks similarly about certain things, especially around friends and family and job and safety and those types of things. So it can be a great way for someone to not other people and be like, oh, that guy's an idiot, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, that one is always causing problems, right? But to see that, oh, wow, that person is just trying to provide for their family, and that person, it really cares about safety, and that person their faith is really important to them like it is to me. Like, there's a lot of these common points that you can find intersections or crossroads or tie-ins with that allow you to kind of align your whys. Like, oh, hey, I'm trying to get you to learn this because that's going to help you do better at your job. And that's going to allow you to be in line to be promoted, or allow you to have more impact on the workplace, or allow this process to be more efficient. Would mean you don't have to work as hard, and you're going to maybe make more money, or you're going to be safer, or whatever, so you can see kind of as you start to align these whys. And hey, you might find out that young person that's working there, that's you can't find a connection point with, that the only thing that they care about is, playing on their Xbox or something like that. You can still find something that they like that you can connect with them on, that allows you to build that relationship. We'll talk more about relationship building later. One interesting side note is there was a study that was done about high fives on a team. And I just had to throw it in there because it just fascinates me. But it was actually a study of basketball teams in the NBA, and they were actually able to statistically predict the teams that were actually going to win, or at least score in the top quartile, by just the number of fist bumps and high fives that they did to each other during practice. And now, so again, like, you got to think about like the old correlation versus causation. It's not saying that if you just tell your team that everybody has to high five every day, that it's going to do that. What the high fives were a symptom of teamwork. And so the idea was that the more human touch points, whether it was like, a high five, a fist bump, whatever it was actually a predictor of teamwork. And that teamwork was a predictor of success, obviously. So, so I just thought that was really fascinating. Side note to jump on there. All right. there's a, we just mentioned the start with why thing with Simon Sinek. He has a great TED Talk. He has probably the most famous TED Talk out of anyone. And I think it's like approximately 20 minutes. And he talks about how in order to connect with people, whether that's to grow your organization or to sell, that you have to, he calls it the law of diffusion of innovation. And it comes back to the why and aligning with people's why. And people don't care so much what you're saying, but they want to align with your why and kind of they want to feel what you feel and kind of have this camaraderie and connection over the why. And he does a great job of explaining that in the Start With Why TED Talk. Highly recommend that if you haven't seen that already. So with that, there's kind of this old funny distribution of what they call the cave dwellers, or, cave standing for citizens against virtually everything. And so on that bell curve distribution, you've got on the one side, you've got the innovators and the early adopters. On the opposite tail, you have the laggards, the people who are just against everything. And then in the middle, you kind of have the wait and see, right? And so you have kind of this swing. And if you want to affect the wait and see folks in the beginning, you've got to impact the early adopters and the innovators and kind of align with the why and get them sold on the concept, and so that they're aligned with what you're trying to do. And it's really an interesting take, but our context here is just about training, coaching, mentorship. So learning how to learn. All right. The next principle is one of my favorites. It's the 80-20 principle, or the Pareto principle. And one of the things that I just find fascinating is seeing or learning something and then seeing that pattern reappear over and over and over in other places. And it's a psychological thing. I should have wrote down what it is, but there's a precedent for that. But 80-20 rule is something that's just incredible. So Pareto principle. So Pareto was a guy a long time ago who just kind of discovered this. And the way he he was a mathematician and he had a garden, and he noticed that 20% of his plants produced 80% of the crop or the yield or the fruit. And so he kind of noticed this, and he started like saying, maybe there's a pattern here. And he started looking around at other things and noticed that this 80-20 principle of 20% of the cause results in 80% of the consequence. And he started to see this just pop up over and all over the place. So there's an 80-20 book that you can get, but it's not necessary, although it's a good read. But 80-20 really pops up everywhere. And 80-20 is like one of those just rule of thumbs. Now, sometimes it's 90-10 or 70-30, but it just hovers around this 80-20 principle. And there's like examples of it everywhere. There's like 20% of the lakes have 80% of the water. 20% of the celestial bodies, like planets and that sort of thing, have 80% of the mass. There's like 20% of the people on Earth have 80% of the wealth monetarily. It's just this rule that just pops up everywhere. There's kind of a funny one that's like 20% of the beer is drank by 80% of the beer is drank by 20% of people. And it just is like if you Google it, you'll just see hundreds and thousands of examples of 80-20 just popping up everywhere. And so the principle of 80-20 for like time management, which again we'll talk about in a future episode, is 20% of what you do on a daily basis is giving you 80% of the return. So basically 20% of what you do is like actually what you would consider like the core of your job in regards to your job in most cases. And 80% is like busy work. It's other things that you have to do. It's like junk that's just getting in the way of you doing that core 20% that's actually making the donuts, right? And so the 20%, so the idea behind that from a time management perspective is that how do we get rid of some of that 80% to improve that 20% to give us even more return for our time based on priorities and things like that, right? But so 80-20 rule pops up everywhere. But again, we're talking about learning and learning how to learn as a leader and as a trainer, coach, mentor. 80-20 rule applied to learning is interesting because 20% of any subject will give you 80% of the information you need to know about that subject. So like, for example, in language, if you're trying to learn a new language, 20% of the words allow you to speak 80% fluent in that language. So, which is really important to know which 20% those words are, right? But there's ways to do that. And that's really empowering because you would think in order to be fluent in a language, you would need to learn every single word in that language, right? But you don't. You only need to learn the core 20% that'll give you 80% fluency in that language, which will be more than enough to have conversations with people. Really kind of interesting. Pops up in lean manufacturing with Six Sigma, pops up with time management, pops up with all sorts of problems. It comes up in quality management where 20%, or I'm sorry, 80% of your returns come from 20% of your customers. If you have that sort of thing in your business, 80% of your volume will come from 20% of your customers, right? Your sales volume. So really kind of interesting, right? So the 80-20 rule kind of says that if we want to learn a subject, we should be able to identify what is that core 20% that we need to learn that gives us 80% mastery. That's a really powerful learning technique to understand what, like Tim Ferriss is famous for talking about the minimal effective dose, right? So what is the minimal amount of work we need to do to get an effective dose, right? It's not saying what's the minimal amount that we can do to like half-ass it or like get minimal results. It's saying, no, for the results that we want to get, what is the minimal dose that will get us there, right? And so 20% of any course material will actually cover 80% of final exams. It's crazy the way this works. Here's my note on the English language. So for example, the English language has about 170,000 words in current use today. But the average individual, the average English speaking person only knows like 20 to 30,000 words. However, the top 100 most used English words account for 50% of all written material, and the top 300 words makes up for 65% of all written material. It's like mind-boggling. So out of that 170,000 words that make up the English language, if you only learned 100 words, you could speak 50% of the language of all written material. It's crazy, right? So if you think about it, like, yeah, I can't learn 170,000 words, but I could learn 100 words, right? And that's not even 20%, right? That's a very small fraction of that. So that's just, again, that's just some more examples of 80-20. We'll continue to point out stuff about 80-20. Just one of those weird things that I don't know why it fascinates me so much, but you can see it kind of amps me up a little bit. Another quote that I love is, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. One of those old proverbs. And so the idea behind that is 80-20, right? So in the expert's mind, there's a lot of ways that it won't work, or a lot of ways that we can't do something, but there's a few ways that do work, right? And so in the beginner, you're just like, oh, I could do any of these and get there. It's like, no. There's a few, right? There's that 20% that are going to give you 80% of the return. So really kind of an interesting thing, I think. All right. Our next thing we're going to mention is the SQ3R method. This may be something that you learned in school. I wish it was taught and retaught everywhere. But SQ3R is a reading comprehension or a study method that, again, allows you to kind of go through some sort of written material and kind of get what you need to get out of it without with the minimal effective dose, I guess is the right way to say it, right? Applying the 80-20 principle. So SQ3R, so it stands for survey, question, read, recall, and review. So a very common learning technique, but I think one that bears repeating. So SQ3R, so the first one is survey. So basically this is a quick, so say you have a book, you pick up The Happiness Advantage or one of the ones that we've talked about, The Only Skill That Matters, some book that you pick up, and you look at SQ3R and the first step is to do a quick survey of the book. So it's a quick skim or scan. You flip through things. Key points that you're looking for is like the front and back cover, table of contents, like big titles as you're flipping through. I'm a big fan of books that have like chapter summaries or things at the end of the chapter that says like, hey, I know I said a lot of things, but here's what I was actually talking about. Like, this is what I want you to take away from this chapter. I like books that have that explicitly spelled out. It makes it kind of easier to understand. And, or if something has a bunch of graphics in it, like charts and graphs or pictures or something that stand out, take a look at those. So again, you're just kind of going quickly. You're just skimming or surveying through, and you're looking for anything that's in bold or bullet pointed or anything like that. And as you're taking this quick survey through, you're kind of like either mentally or physically kind of marking certain areas, or like, okay, that looks interesting, or like, oh, I know that, so I don't need to go through that in detail. This one doesn't look like it really applies to what I'm trying to get out of this. So you can kind of quickly do a survey through there. The cue is to question. So while you're doing the survey, you're kind of asking yourself like some questions about like, what's interesting, what's important, what's practical. And as you're kind of going through, like, so again, if it's not interesting, it's not important, or it's not practical, why bother, right? So what you're doing by the survey is just kind of like looking through and just seeing what piques your interest, what's going to be practical, or what can I take away, what can I do? An important thing to remember is that a lot of books, like a lot of publishers of books, have minimum word counts that they won't publish a book unless it's over a certain word count for a certain subject. And so what happens is, like, sometimes people are forced to put like some fluff into their books, and some have more, and you've probably seen this before, but so really 80-20 applies to books, and really 20% of that book is what that book is, right? The thesis of the book. So what's empowering to know about that is you don't actually need to read every single word on every single page, which is what I used to think. And it would be very daunting looking at a 400-page book and being like, oh my gosh, that's going to take me forever to go through, and I don't know if I'm going to remember everything, and so on. So just understanding 80-20 and how it applies to SQ3R learning is really important and empowering information, because it's like, okay, what is the core 20% of this book that is either important, interesting, or practical? So that's kind of like the takeaways that you want to be looking at. So, all right, that was the S and the Q. Now the first R is read. So at some point you got to actually read it, right? So, and again, the example we're using is a physical book, but this applies to other learning things. It could be an audiobook, a digital, it could be a class that you're taking online, whatever it is, right? So now we're like looking at those sections that we marked or highlighted or dog-eared the page or whatever we did to kind of mark like, okay, this was interesting to me, or this is something that I need to focus on. And those marked areas are where you kind of focus your attention. And, there's ways to do that, but the most important way to focus your attention is just to not try to do multiple things at once. Like, the brain literally cannot multitask, can only do one thing at a time. So if you are ever doing more than one thing, like texting and driving, or, watching TV and reading a book, like you can only do one of those. You can't do both. So again, mark out the sections that you think you need and actually really focus your attention on there. Maybe maybe find a quiet place and silence your phone or whatever you need to do, put on some music, whatever you need to do to kind of really focus your attention on the highlighted or marked areas that you decided were the critical 20% that were going to give you 80% results. The next R is recall. So this is where we're actually going to read a section or a paragraph or maybe a chapter or whatever section we marked out. We're going to read through that. And then afterwards, we're going to look away or close the book or whatever we're going to do and attempt to recall or restate in our own words, or sometimes people will say recite instead of recall for this R. We're going to try to recall, restate in our own words, or recite the words that we read. And this is an important step that is often missed. So again, this has to be something that you really want to learn, right? It's not going to be a casual read like this. This is going to require work and effort. But if you do this, it will stick in your mind. And the reason is, if we attempt to recall or restate in our own word, restate in your own words is better, as long as the way you restate it is appropriate to what you were trying to learn. If you do that, the reason it works is because you're using those neural pathways that we talked about at the beginning, where we were talking about how the brain works and how this is a way that you can be actively involved or actively engaged in reading. So if you get to the point where, you've read through a certain section, and then you look away or you close the book and you attempt to recite it or come back to it and you can't, well, you have to, it's because that pathway is weak and temporary, right? Remember we said the first time you connect the dots in your brain, it's weak and temporary. So you have to go back and like look at it again. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if that's what if your goal is to learn something. There's absolutely nothing wrong with rereading that section and then attempting to restate it or recall it or, review it. So that was the second R. So the last R is review. And so this is where we are reviewing what we just learned, again, to strengthen the neural pathway. But what's important about the review is that what we're looking to do in the review stage is we're looking to connect what we just learned to something that we already knew. And this is an important concept that I first learned from the Make It Stick book and the studies that those scientists did. Is it's not just about like repeating over and over and over again a date or a phrase or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. If we're trying to learn something, we have to try to connect what we're learning now to something else, because this is the point that they made, is that every learning is built on prior knowledge. And so this is why, like, you have to do first grade before second grade before high school, right? You can't just jump to the end, because every concept builds upon another concept. And that's really kind of the whole idea behind the Crossroads, the Leadership Crossroads podcast. So as we continue to look at this, we have to remember that if we're training someone, anything that we teach them has to be built on prior knowledge. And a big mistake that I've seen a lot of people make in a leadership position is to assume, and it's easy to do, and I'm guilty of this myself, but to assume that the person you're trying to train knows what you know and that you're just giving them a little piece of information. You have to assess where they are so that you can fill in the gap between what they know and what they need to know, right? So if you're trying to build learning, it has to be built on prior knowledge. And this is why things like analogies or stories are great ways to train, because they allow people to connect things to things that they already know. So assessing learning, connecting it to prior knowledge. So when we've done the skim, the question, the read, the review, or the read, the recall, now we're in the review space. And what we're trying to do is say, how does this apply to things that I already know? And then how do I use this neural pathway to retrieve? And the retrieval process is the important part. Retrieval is where you practice what they call spaced repetition. And spaced repetition is where you go back later and try to remember. So the next day or a week from now, and you try to remember or review, right? The third R, what did I read in that last section? And if you can recall it in the review time, like a week later, then it's starting to sink in, right? You're starting to use that retrieval process. And there's like apps and stuff that you can get that'll like allow you to put stuff in and then kind of randomly pop up later so that you can kind of do this spaced repetition retrieval practice. But even just something as simple as like looking at reviewing the book, a week later or something. One really important side note, and we'll talk about this in a future episode, but sleep is where learning is encoded into the brain. And so if you're not sleeping well or you're having trouble sleeping and things like that, something you need to focus on because it impacts everything else about physical and mental health, but it impacts learning and actually it's where it's encoded. So especially for kids that are in school or for people that are adults that are in school or trying to learn something on their own, whatever it is, sleep is really important because that's when the learning actually gets encoded in the brain, actually makes it like it puts it in its proper place and kind of makes it make sense to you. So that's why that phrase about like sleeping on something is like so important, like sleep on a problem or sleep on something, like literally is how the brain processes. So it's important. And there's no affiliation, but there's a great app called Readwise. And basically if you use a lot of digital books like Kindle or something similar, you can use Readwise to take your highlights. Like if you highlight something in Kindle, it'll sync over to Readwise, and Readwise will create a feed, basically like a social media feed, but it's based all on your highlights of books that you've read. And so you're able to do this spaced repetition and retrieval and strengthen those neural pathways on things that you've highlighted that you want to remember through your e-readers or through your Kindles and things like that. So really a cool app. So again, there's other ways to read through a book. That's the SQ3R. Another quick way is they just call it like the skimming method, where you're just kind of skimming through things, looking for certain key areas that hook you in or grab your attention or, align with your why, things like that. That's a great way to go. But just know if you do skimming, it's not going to have the same impact as if you do the full-on SQ3R. But again, situation dictates, and skimming may be appropriate if it's a book that's not critical that you remember the core items from, and you're just kind of doing a quick look through. There's another method called the OPIR method, OPIR, from Brian Tracy, and he kind of has this accelerated learning methodology. And he claims that if you follow this method, you can change a 6-hour read into 90 minutes and that you'll have 80% recall of that material. Now, the OPIR, the OPIR method, if you look at it in depth, it's basically SQ3R said in a different way. So basically you have the overview, which is kind of, again, similar to the first part of SQ3R, where you're skimming through, looking at the table of contents, picking out what applies to you. There's the preview, where you kind of read through things quickly, looking at keywords, headers, summaries, bullet points, things like that. So that's preview, the OP. And then I is in view. So you have preview and then in view. So preview is you're kind of going through it quickly, you're skimming, picking out the areas that are important. And then the in view is where you're kind of like reading on purpose, or you're kind of like looking at exactly the thing that's the focused reading part of the SQ3R. And then it's got the review, where you do a review similar to that spaced repetition practice. So it's very similar to SQ3R, just said in a different way, but kind of puts some numbers to it about like the 6 hours to 90 minutes and having better recall. There's other tools out there where there's like the Optimize Me app, there's the Thinker app, there's Cliff Notes. You can find like YouTube channels that'll give like summaries of books. Like a good one is Productivity Game. And there's just like other way you can do audiobooks or podcasts. You can like speed them up, go through them quickly, and then kind of slow them down at certain points that you want to focus on. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get like summaries or bullet point versions of information. And so the point is, pick a method, have a plan, and then go into it. And this is more like if you're trying to learn something, there's kind of another aspect of like if you're trying to train someone else. And so to kind of go into that a little bit, there's a great quote that to teach is to learn twice over. So if you really want to learn something, a great way to learn it is to learn it with the intent to teach it, and then teach it to someone, and then kind of learn from that, because there's a different level of paying attention that you do when you know you're going to have to talk about it to someone else or explain it to someone else. And so that's why train the trainer programs can be very effective. And another tool that I really like is called peer instruction, where the instructor, the teacher, the coach, or whatever basically kind of prompts and has more of a guided discussion with the team instead of like a lecture, and lets the attendees, the learners, the team, whoever the peers, the peer group, kind of almost train each other based on things that they might already know, but again, guided by the instructor. And a great way to do that is to run through some training modules, and then have whether that's through a group discussion or lecture method or any videos or online, whatever it is, but have the people taking the training write down something that was important to them, or that they want to remember, kind of the one thing that they want to like teach someone else, and then have time during the session to allow the peers to go over what they thought was important out of that presentation or video or whatever it was. And the cool thing there is that it reinforces their neural pathways by doing that, but it also allows peers, so they're hearing it in someone else's summary or someone else's words, the same kind of information. And so maybe the way that I said it is different from the way that you say it, and the way that you say it resonates with the third person that's in the room, and they get it when you say it. So hearing it from different perspectives, or different, saying it in their own words kind of thing, which is a really great way, and allows them to be actively engaged. That's really critical. Another really interesting technique is called the Aristotle's triptych. And Aristotle was a philosopher, died in 322 BC, like long time ago, right? And he was kind of onto a bunch of stuff here. It's kind of interesting. So his methodology was for training, right? For training someone else is like, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. So in other words, kind of give them a summary of the things that they're going to learn. And I would add why they should care to that, right? So that they're focused. Then in the middle, you actually give them the information. And then at the end, give them kind of a summary of the key takeaways. And I think that's always a great way. And that's how I like to learn. And as far as like getting a chapter summary after each chapter, or even an intro, like here's what you're going to learn, information, and then here's kind of the summary. Great way to kind of reinforce key concepts. Again, that critical 20% is what we're after. Another great method to keep in mind as a trainer on training someone, especially in adult education or professionally in a workplace, is to have, they call it the 3 Ps of training: the purpose, the plan, and the payoff. So the purpose is like, why is this training taking place? What are we doing here? What's the goal, right? So again, this is that alignment that we talked about earlier. Why they should care. That's kind of the attention grabber. That's kind of like why they should focus. Really critical aspect of training. Then there's the plan, where you say, all right, or it could be process. Sometimes it's purpose, process, payoff. What's the agenda? How are we going to do this training? What are we going to learn? That's kind of the process part. And then the payoff is kind of the traditional or the more old school approach of like, at the conclusion of this training, you should be able to, or you should understand that, and then tell them, that sort of thing. But again, that payoff is super important, because that's the WIFM. That's the what's in it for me, right? So Like, here's why you should care. Here's how we're going to do this training or learning process. And then here's what's in it for you. Here's what you're going to get if you go through this process. So really kind of critical aspect to how we do training. All right. Getting close to being done here. One interesting point, and there's a great Andrew Huberman episode called The Science of Setting and Achieving Goals. And although that's not the focus of what we're talking about here today, but this is the concept of failing as part of learning and part of growing. So there's a great quote from John Maxwell where he says that the difference between average people and successful people is how they respond to failure. But again, so here's when we're talking about being a coach, being a mentor, being a trainer, being a leader, it's a very common thing to wonder, like, how hard should we make this for the people we're leading or training, or, how aggressive should we set these goals? How aggressive should we get with our sales target? Or how hard should we make this course to pass this course, right? So it turns out that there's some studies on this that is really interesting. So what these studies have shown is that the appropriate amount of failing is about 15%. And what that means is, like, failing is part of growing. It's a part of learning. That's how we learn. We try stuff, it doesn't work, we make adjustments, we try again, and eventually we find a way that works. Or there's a number of ways that you can apply failing to learning and growing. That's just one example. But there's this Goldilocks principle, right? Too easy? Well, we're leaving opportunity on the table, right? Too hard, and we're always, failing. Well, then we're not actually getting our goal, right? So there's this just right point of the Goldilocks principle: too hard, too easy, just right. And that's setting the goal or the hardness of what you're trying to accomplish to be at about that 85-15%. Sounds pretty close to 80-20 to me. Sorry. So what that's saying is that if it's too hard, we're setting people up for failure. And if it's too easy, we're leaving potential on the table, right? So we need to set our goals in such a way, according to these studies, that failing as a part of learning is we're going to fail about 15% of the time, but we're going to succeed about 85% of the time. And that's the appropriate Goldilocks zone of how hard we should make any goal. Now, again, because it's a rule of thumb, I would consider it, I don't know if the people in the study would consider this, but I would consider that 80-20 and say, just apply 80-20 to your goals, right? And I think that'll be all that you'll need. All right. So one final thing, so Jim Quick is kind of a famous, well, he's an author. He has courses. He's got a lot of stuff, and his stuff is really fantastic. He's got a book called Limitless that I highly recommend. But here's kind of like bringing it back to the real world. So the median number of words per book is 64,000. So he says that you could actually read a book a week. You could read a book a week if you spent about 45 minutes a day in reading. And the reason is because the median number of words per book is about 64,000. The average reader reads about 200 words per minute. And if you read 200 words per minute in 45 minutes a day, you could finish one book every week on average, right? Some will take you a little longer, some will take you a little less. Now you could cut that down. Like you could cut that down to like, a quarter of that, or a half of that, read for 20 minutes, read for 10 minutes, right? And you could still finish, a book a month or whatever it is, right? Do the math. So reading a book a week or reading a few minutes a day is my point. By reading a few minutes a day, you need 10, 15 minutes a day, you could finish a significant number of books by the end of the year. So there's kind of that old saying about like, when's the best time to plant a tree? Well, it's either 20 years ago or today, right? So if you want to start, kind of this learning process or this, there's a great phrase that leaders are readers, and try saying that 10 times fast, but leaders are readers, and just kind of using SQ3R, using 80/20, you can cut this 64,000 words way down. So you could easily jump into that book a week or a couple books a month kind of range, even at a very minimal time commitment per day. But it's got to be time that's dedicated and purposeful and focused, but really only a few minutes a day. I mentioned James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, earlier, maybe in the previous episode. And he has this thing called the 2-minute rule. If you want to make something a new habit, just decide. He's got many, ways to make something a habit. That's the whole point of the book. But the 2-minute rule says you just decide that you're going to do your new habit for 2 minutes. That's it. And so, you're going to go to the gym. Okay, I'm going to go to the gym for 2 minutes, right? Or I'm going to start reading books more purposefully. I'm going to just do it for 2 minutes. And I think that's such a great way to remove the scariness of committing to doing something that we want to start doing. Is just say, I'm going to do it for 2 minutes. And one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to get into it and realize that you're actually kind of into it and you're going to do it for longer than 2 minutes, and it's going to be fine, and you actually get something done. Or you do it for the 2 minutes and you stop like you said you were going to, and hey, you did 2 minutes of something that you would have done 0 minutes of had you not done this, right? And then over time, doing it 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, eventually becomes a habit, and then it becomes part of your routine, and then it's easier, and now you're doing it for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever's appropriate for that activity. So even if you took this 45 minutes and you said, all right, I'm going to do it only for 2 minutes, you're still making progress in a positive direction. And that's really what it's all about. So he's got some other good tips Jim Quick does for how to read. There's a lot of folks that will say that they're not good readers, and that's why they don't. And legitimately there's people who need help in that regard. A lot of it is training, though. A lot of it is focus, and a lot of it is practice. Now, but there's, hey, audiobooks are great. Book summaries are great. Like, there's other ways. Like, you don't have to spend read every word on every page and spend that extra time if you don't want to. But really, there's a lot of things that, just kind of sitting down and focusing. There's ways to learn how to speed read where you're able to read much faster. And then Jim Quick has some courses and to be able to do that, to where you can significantly double or triple your words per minute and still have good retention of what you're reading. So I would recommend checking that out if that's something of interest to you. But even if you're at the average point of 200 words per minute, and even if you only do a couple minutes a day, you can still make some great progress, whether it's reading, listening to an audiobook, taking a course, whatever it is. But be a lifelong learner. That's really important. And again, like we said, don't let your learning lead to knowledge. Let your learning lead to action. Be determined to learn, and no one can stop you. Really, really powerful quotes. So as a really quick summary, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about how the brain works. We talked about the fight or flight response. We talked about how we need to focus on attitude more than IQ, have that positive can-do attitude. We talked about some team building that you can do, whether that's truth or lies, whether that's the grateful exercise, stuff you can do on your own, like exercise or journaling or writing down something positive from the previous day, or sending someone an encouraging email or text message. Then we talked about kind of the law of accelerating returns, the 80/20 rule. We talked about SQ3R, the purpose, plan, payoff, the Aristotle's triptych, and how much failing is appropriate when we're setting goals, especially goals around learning. And now we're here at the conclusion. So I know I talked a lot. I appreciate everybody taking the time. If you're still listening, that means that you're one step closer on your learning journey. So I would really encourage you to take some of these tools, let your learning lead to action. Appreciate everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.